Chapter 331. Construction. Hand in your axes and hatchets. The skeletons turned in their tools and readied their weapons, their blades gleaming before their eyes. It seemed that they knew what was coming next. After gathering the logging tools, Jay took them a little further away from the swamp water. Getting to slightly drier ground, he made 2 large bone piles. One for his throne, and the other for his skeletons. After assembling himself a little outpost, he sat in this throne and began give his commander orders. This essence is securely nested within the heart of NOV Euros LSZN. Blue stood by Jay's side while the rest of the skeletons knelt. Blue, you're in charge of them. I want you to hunt as many of the flaming lights as possible. I don't care how much any of you get injured, I want you to prioritize aggression and killing speed. That bone pile is for eating, and if any of you die I'll just resummon you. Jay took out his crucible, the large bone bowl he used for fire pits. When you gather more of those ember spheres, place them in this. He pointed to the crucible. Jay waved his hand, shooing them away, but he gave one last, silent order. Keep Lamp and Dark patrolling nearby. Just in case. Blue nodded, and the rest of the skeletons rose to their feet. Blue began to craft some extra daggers for the smaller skeletons, while the larger ones bolted off into the fog. Jay sensed all of them charging away, all except for Lamp and Dark, which lingered just out of sight, hidden in the fog. After receiving new daggers from Blue, the smaller ones paired off, probably to hunt in packs, and the last to leave was Blue, which gave Jay a respectful bow before disappearing. Jay had a slight smile as he listened to their bones clinking away into the heavy fog, and the sound slowly disappeared until it was quiet. He relaxed, leaning back into his chair. It feels nice to be alone. He whispered to himself, and a gentle smile appeared as he let his eyes close, drifting off into a short nap. 20x 20x bait x bait x bait x bait x bait x bait x bait x. Some time later, Jay heard some amber spheres tapping and rolling into his crucible, and he awoke to a number of X notifications. Before he could crack his eyes open, a skeleton rattled away, disappearing into the fog before Jay even realized which one it was. Probably Blue. He glanced around at the fog, then the bones below his chair, glad he didn't spot any slithering bugs crawling up to burrow into his ankles. Stretching his arms, he left the throne to gather more of the breaking shards, the amber spheres. He yawned, glancing back at his throne, which was really just a chair on a pile of bones. It's comfortable, but kind of pathetic. I need to make a room or something. If it's bone, then I should be able to use living blueprints and easily pack it away. The fog was getting darker, and Jay had overslept, but he was determined to make himself a room for the night. As for going back to the island and sleeping in the shack, well, that was not an option. The smell is bad enough, but who knows what a lonely old hag would do. Jay shrugged. He would rather sleep outdoors. Dark, come closer and witness me. You can teach the others later. He commanded, knowing Dark and Lamp were still close, protecting their master from the shadows. Dark sprang from the fog without much noise at all, and its glowing eyes appeared before his skull did. Scary little bastard, Jay thought, then got to work. If I want to store it as living blueprints inside the gauntlet, it will need to be all bone. First thing I'll need is a floor. Dark, dig out a large square for me, about 1 inch deep. Jay pointed to the ground, and the skeleton got to work while he marked the boundary. The hole was a 10-foot wide square, and would be filled with molten bone and made into a single floor panel. Jay watched Dark as it dug, and using claws and daggers to move dirt was a problem, making it more time-consuming. As well as that, there were some gash marks in the dirt, which would leave sharp edges all over the bottom of the floor once it formed. For now, it didn't matter as it was a floor, but if this were wall it would look quite bad, at least on the outside. It's large enough to roll out my swag inside, and later I could add a desk for study, Jay thought, already planning out his room. As Dark slowly cut the dirt out, the idea of having a portable room was something that made his heart begin to flutter, and he could only imagine how much easier it would make traveling. Jay couldn't stand to wait any longer. I better help Dark out, he thought, but didn't bend down to get his own hands dirty. Of course not, he was a necromancer. Jay quickly grabbed some bones and melted them into a flat semicircle shape. He attached it to the end of a long femur bone, and created the world's first bone shovel. Another novel tool. Here. Jay held it out, and Dark tilted its head to the side in wonder, but then sprung forwards. It threw his twin daggers into the ground. They pierced the earth near Jay's boots, landing perfectly next to each other as it grabbed the shovel. With the shovel, it was able to dig out a flat hole and easily remove the excess dirt. Jay smiled as he watched, keenly waiting for his creation. While the fog grew darker, he took out his luminous orb. Adding a little mana to it, it released a comfortable warm orange glow that chased away his sleepiness along with the dark. Jay usually would have worried about whatever was out there seeing his light, but after using shade vision and looking through the fog himself, he knew that only lamp was close enough to see its glow. 8x 8x 20x. More leeches in another light. I wonder if they're more active at night. After Dark finished the square 1-inch hole, Jay had it fill in the gaps the daggers had cut, and flatten it out with its new shovel, and then he began phase 2. Lamp, Blue, come back. Jay took a piece of bone from his pile and held it over the square mold. When Lamp and Blue returned, Blue attempted to help fill the hole, but he didn't let the mad bones directly to the hole. Wait. Do like this. Jay added mana to the bone in his hand, and let it melt away, drilling and dripping into the mold. This would stop the solid bones from making dents in the dirt, which would have shown up later once it solidified. The skeletons both nodded and grabbed bones, melting them into the mold too. They ran out of mana before it was finished, but made it past the halfway mark, which Jay was quite pleased with. Alright, I can finish this myself. Return to duties. Jay waved his hand, and after Dark got its daggers back, the three of them disappeared into the fog. Jay melted more and more bones into the mold until it was full. To fill in the hole, he guessed that he went through about 10 skeletons worth of bone. Each of them were of the Helvetian variety that were left over from the Revenge Pact. The bone square was all melted, but each melted part was added separately, which would cause cracking problems, especially if you were to walk on it. Okay, here we go. Jay talked to himself, taking a deep breath as he held his hands out. A glowing cloud of necrotic mana formed between his hands, and grew into a large ball, going up to his elbows. He crouched down, lowering it and holding it over the bone square. The insipid mana quickly dived into the large bone mass and began to melt it together. Jay released his control, and for a moment the entire square glowed green. Somewhere between liquid and molten, it became perfectly flat, and Jay saw his reflection in it for a moment. But under his command, the mana dispersed, leaving a perfectly flat bone plate behind. Yet that was not all Jay had gained from this giant crafted plate. Research acquired. Necromantic construction. 1%. Necromantic. Jay raised a brow, seeing his new line of research. Chapter 332. Fateful Day. How come? Why did I get it now? Jay wondered, looking at his necromantic construction research. Unfortunately, analyzing it gave him no description, and no additional information. Maybe the sleeping spot and the bone crucible were too small to count as construction, or perhaps they didn't count as construction, since they're not part of a building. Construction research, huh? I suppose the bridge didn't give me any because all I did was dump bones down, huh? Looking around, it was nighttime, so Jay got on with his project. Using living blueprints, he stashed the large bone square into his gauntlet, then stepped over to his bone pile, and put his throne in his inventory. Then he brought out the square again. The large square panel fell onto the pile of bones, but to Jay's annoyance, it tilted to the side and slid off. Ah, I need foundations. Dark. Report. He ordered. In a moment, Dark appeared again, and in another short moment, it already had new orders and began digging. This time, it was a rectangular-shaped hole. About 14 feet long, 3 inches wide, and 3 inches deep of beam shape. To keep the square floor plate stable and flat, Jay only needed support beams long enough to reach each corner of it, about 3 feet high off the ground, but he decided to make them long enough to reach the roof he was planning. It would be structurally stronger if each beam went up past the floor and connected to the walls above it, helping to hold them in place. At least, that was the logic behind it. Jay stashed the large bone square away, and began to fill up the beam mold with bones, while Dark dug out the other end. They were an efficient team, and while a construction worker would be useful, he still wanted an assassin, so he quickly returned Dark to the fog once it was finished, letting it blend with the shadows nearby. Now, I want more of that research, Jay thought. He copied his process before melting bones into the long beam mold, then creating a cloud of mana over it which seeped into the bone structure, and made it mix together thoroughly. This time, Jay decided to grab another bone and swirled it through the liquid bone, mixing it all together for good measure. He slowly dispersed the necrotic mana, and the ghostly glow left the beam as it solidified. Necromantic construction research 2%. Nice, Jay nodded, so my theory is correct. He checked his mana, too. MP. 98 148. Just making the beam was a large hit to Jay's mana, and he felt slightly empty, though it was nothing like the feeling of being lightheaded when he was extremely low mana. Jay made 2 more of these beams, but he only gained 1 more % to his necromantic research. Necromantic construction research 3%. MP. 58,148. MP. 18,148. So making the same thing over and over again means I will be less likely to learn anything. Makes sense. He shrugged, storing the beams away as living blueprints. He only needed 1 more, but each beam took 40 mana, so he would need to wait for regeneration, or pull his skeletons back. Thankfully, the wait wouldn't be too long as he now had mana regeneration from choosing the path of mana. For now, his mana regeneration passive was level 15, which gave him 1.5 mana per minute. It wasn't much, but it wasn't negligible, and with enough investment into his mana stat, it would only grow, along with his library of necromantic constructions, blueprints and research. Tap. A skeleton dropped another amber sphere into the crucible, then disappeared before Jay even turned his head. Hey, wait a second. Jay called, and the skeleton appeared from the shadowy fog, stepping into the warm light of the luminous orb. It was Handy, the champion. This chapter made its debut appearance via M0V3LB1N. Jay pointed to the beam mold. Dump your mana into this, he ordered. The skeleton marched over, plunged its 2-handed sword into the ground and held its hands over the mold. As the cloud filled the hole, Jay released bones into it. The necrotic mana made them hover for a moment before they melted into the hole. Handy used all its mana, and after completing its task it bowed to Jay, grabbed its bastard sword and left. Good job, Handy. Jay whispered as it left, and used some of his own mana to finish the beam-making process. Necromantic construction research 4%. 1exp 1exp 1exp. Something attacked blue skeletons. Seems like some bone eaters came back. Jay thought, identifying the 1exp notifications as the bone-eating eels near the swamp bridge. Blue, if your sub-skeletons at the bridge need help, feel free to send them some backup. Thankfully, there were only 3 eels slain, so it seemed that there were not many eels left, at least not near the bridge, so Jay went back to work. As to whether Blue would send backup, well, that was up to the it. Okay, I have 4 beams in 1 large floor panel. That should be enough. Jay took them all out and checked their measurements again, noting that each beam was 13 feet long, and the square panel was 10 by 10. I'll be living in a cube for a while. But that's okay, it's much better than sleeping outside all the time. He nodded. 20x 20x 20x. Seems like the skeletons found a fight, he smiled, then thought about how he would assemble these parts together. BRRR, GRRRROOOOO. A deep rumbling suddenly rolled across the skies above. Jay looked up into the sky, seeing only foggy darkness. Shit. He couldn't see anything, but a cold breeze suddenly shifted the air, touching his cheeks. A storm was coming, and at the worst possible time. I haven't even got walls or a fucking roof yet, come on. He yelled into the fog, which gave no answer other than more rolls of thunder. 20x 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 20x. Can't see the clouds. Too hard to predict how much time I have before it starts raining. He glanced back towards the swamp water. Azra will be fine under the noon leather blanket. I need to think about myself. I'm not going to let myself freeze in this shithole swamp. He immediately sent for backup. If he was about to craft a shelter, he would need mana. All skeletons except for Red, Sweeper, Lamp, and Blue sub-skeletons are to finish what you're doing and report immediately. Be plus or minus less than 1/2 L. Every skeleton was summoned except for those guarding the bridge, those with Higatha and Azra, and Lamp who lingered nearby, hiding in the fog. 20x 20x. More of the firelights died as the skeletons finished up a battle. The skeletons were giving it their all so they could return to their master's side. Jay walked over to his bone pile, and added more bones until he had a platform raised up to his waist. This should keep my feet dry, hopefully. TTTTT. Jay suddenly frowned, hearing faint taps of rain in the fog around him. The storm was beginning and he still didn't have a roof over his head. Handy and Blue were the first to return, and Jay began to put his plan to stay dry into action. I'm not getting fucking frozen again, never again. He whispered to himself, nodding slowly with an unblinking stare. His flesh and bones still remembered the shivering chill from the bottom of the Lossley Mountain path on that fateful day. Chapter 333. Extraction. More rain began to tap against the muddy ground, and he could hear it splashing into the swamp water nearby. Jay let out the square plate from his gauntlet. "Handy, Blue, hold this up, quick," he ordered, pointing at the giant bone plate, and pulled out a beam next. The other skeletons hadn't returned, and Jay glanced at the empty molds for the bone beams in the square, then at the skeletons awkwardly holding the square on its side. If he wanted to stay dry, there wasn't enough time to make a roof plate. "Ah, fuck it. It will have to do." Jay frowned, and attached the very bottom of the beam to the corner of the square plate. Some melted bone was all it took to connect them, but to add some strength, he hastily plucked some femur bones, and made triangle supports between the beam and the square plate. The rain began to sprinkle as Jay attached the second beam, and as he was reinforcing it, more skeletons returned. "One on each corner, now," Jay yelled, dumping the 2 other beams down, each of them slamming onto the dirt. The original appearance of this chapter can be found at any of Euros LS at 1N. There's no time to make a new roof panel. The floor will have to do. Red's 2 sub-skeletons grabbed a beam and helped Dark move it into place, attaching it to another corner of the square bone plate. Under Blue's supervision and guidance, they copied Jay, and with Dark and Blue's meager mana reserves, they managed to successfully attach one beam, then moved on to the next. Jay added the support bones, saving what little mana he had left. Dark ran out of mana, but Handy could still help. Even though it had the champion role, it had a small amount of mana. Jay helped to attach the last beam, and while attaching the support bones he began to feel dizzy, getting closer to the bottom of his mana pool. "Place it on the bone platform. Move." He pointed, rubbing his head, and wobbling with a side step. Blue noticed that Jay seemed odd. Master was not walking straight, so it did something odd itself. It stood by his side and held its arm out. It confused Jay to see its skeleton holding its arm out like a butler, but as he reached out and grabbed it, he understood what it was trying to do. "Ah, thanks, Blue." Jay smiled. It was small things like this that made Jay appreciate his skeletons even more. It was the little actions like this that truly showed their loyalty, and it was something that Jay was not used to, so he appreciated it all the more. Blue held Jay up while the skeletons took the structure and moved it on top of the bone platform. It was an assembly of the bone floor plate with 4 square beams attached at each corner. Jay's efforts had resulted in a 10 by 10 foot square panel placed atop 4 13-foot beams, each connecting to a corner, making a roof over a waist-high pile of bones. As they placed it onto the bone pile, they pushed bones apart to dig the beams down into it. Jay was a little disappointed, as he had planned to attach the square plate approximately 3 feet up the beams. This way, it would become a floor with enough ground clearance for level 1 skeletons to dash under, and there would be 10 feet of beams rising above the floor, which he could attach more 10x10 wall panels to, forming a cube room. Now, the rain ruined his plans to stay dry. The floor would become the roof. Before stepping under the new shelter, he stopped and glanced at it for a moment as rain began to tap on his head, admiring his construction. "This is shit." He frowned. "Uneven, weak, slanted, tilting, wobbly shit." He shook his head and crawled onto the bone platform as the rain began. All the skeletons stood around him, the rain trickling down their skulls and past their jaws as their green eyes faintly glowed, looking at their master's miserable frown. A small wind gust blew some rain which tapped against Jay's feet, even though he was under the roof. "You're fucking joking." His face turned bitter, as he knew that if a little rain could get to his feet, then his boots would be soaked after a while. For a moment he gave up, looking at his skeleton staring back at him. Then he sighed, and while clenching his jaw from a mix of bitter anger and frustration, he got to work again. Without thinking things through or really caring about possible downsides, Jay began releasing bones around himself, piling them up until they got to his knees. He had Blue come and help him up, stepping foot on new heights and stomping the bone down, then began the process again, and he eventually made it close enough to touch the roof of his new construction. The bone platform quickly went from a waist-high flat arrangement of bones to a large piled heap, nearly 6 feet tall. "Now, I can have a damn rest." He added some more bones down to make a flat top, placed his rectangular sleeping spot down, and got his sleeping swag out. Adding his clothes and boots to his inventory, he slipped inside as the rain began to beat down on his skeletal roof. He was still frowning, but he closed his eyes. He enjoyed the warmth and the soft tapping above. The rancid smell of the swamp and its sticky, humid feeling all but disappeared. He succeeded in making himself a dry place to sleep. Return to duties. "Lou, stay close," he ordered, with his eyes still closed. The skeleton feet tapped away across the wet ground, and Jay drifted off to sleep. Lamp and blue kept him safe, though there wasn't anything out there that posed a threat. The fog and the firelights acted as barriers. Everything that ventured into the fog from the outside world would be injured with unhealing fire, and would need to flee or perish. Whether high-level beast or curious glade deer, nothing would want a painful unhealing wound, and certainly not a handful of these wounds. The rain continued through the night, but Jay was exhausted from the journey and slept through it all, tucked away inside his swag. Mirror Reality 34. Norgrim nursed a cup of winter tea as he stood with Evelyn, looking out through a pane-wood window, and watching some students in the stone courtyard below. Norgrim, it's still too soon. The last portal wasn't even 1 week ago, and you want to go again. The mirror reality can't handle it. It will need to. He's out there alone in the wilderness. We need to get to him before something else does, and we can't afford to let a necromancer, a human necromancer, be lost to some beast snack or even worse, if the mage hunters catch him. I want to save Jay as much as you do. I know it's already costly enough using the warp charges, but can you please at least wait till the clouds stop shuddering, and the color returns to the distant mountains? She frowned, looking at the students below. We will wait as long as we can. Rest assured, I won't risk the safety of our students or the mirror reality, just so we have another weapon on our side. Norgrim nodded, and placed his empty cup on his desk. Hang on a moment, Evelyn said, and opened the latched window to call out below. You two. Stop that immediately. 2 students looked up as they were caught, and broke their combined spells, causing a rock to explode as it smashed into the ground. One had made a small portal above another and tossed a rock inside, causing it to pick up speed as it endlessly fell through the portals. The other formed a cylinder around the portals and sucked the air out, which let the rock endlessly speed up in the vacuum. Evelyn shook her head and gave them a disapproving look, then slowly closed the window. She sighed, closing the latch. Our students aren't weapons. They aren't kids either. They're just young people who have had their world turned upside down. Lara, we're going out again. Thanks to William, we have his location, much further south than before. It's an unported area, so we will end up somewhere nearby. We'll be in unknown land, so we're bringing 3 Orin to find a dungeon we can hijack to get back. Good. Lara said, her eyes narrowing on a map. She was still angered by her failure last time, a blemish on her perfect record, and this time she was not going to be so trivial about the extraction. How long till we leave? The portal will be ready in about a day. I've been setting it up since we got back, but Norgrim still hasn't given the order. Chapter 334. Hijack Portals. Loki was a 3rd Academy student. Slender, tall and with jet black hair, he often went unnoticed, blending into the background. As for his variant class, it was a peculiar ability to switch 2 objects of equal size or mass. It started out weak, only able to switch 2 objects about the size of an apple, but as his powers grew, the ability gave him the power to switch humans. Unfortunately, it was still a long way from being useful in combat, so he could only rely on his cunning to get himself some exp, and today, his craftiness and speech mastery had paid off. He and some other weaker students were given an escort through a dungeon. Smiley, Aka Matheson. Just wait a second. Smiley glared at some weaker adventurers with him, making them stop in their tracks right before a dungeon entrance. Smiley was still trapped inside Mirror Reality 34, and had not given up on his escape. Every day he tested ideas, tested people, and questioned students. He was slowly cultivating a wealth of knowledge, listening and secretly learning, and after good behavior, he was granted access to various classes offered to the students. The good behavior he was practicing. He asked if he could help students through dungeons. Because he was trapped here, and had a paralysis parasite attached to his spine, they gave him a lot of free rein, so his request didn't raise any red flags. To protect him from the students, he was given a special position as a trainer assistant, leaving him with authority somewhere between a student and a teacher. Unfortunately, because some students couldn't use their powers during sword training, they were left vengeful after he crushed them, and a few small things had already happened, which kept his senses heightened and alert at all times. The students began to curse him. He found that he kept tripping when he walked upstairs. No matter how slowly or carefully he placed each foot, he would trip on at least 1 step whenever he tried to ascend a set of stairs. Another changed his hair from golden blonde to a deep blue color whenever he ate food. The curses were annoying at first, but quickly grew much more insidious, such as when he picked up a blade, he would have a strong desire to cut himself with it, and the desire would only go away once he drew blood. It was as much a test of his will as it was his sanity, but despite the curses, his anger didn't flare up. He learned to remain calm, calculating and cold, while he stored up his wrath for two things: working out and sword training. The Mirror Reality students were as much of a test as any dungeon, and little did they know that they were slowly forging him into something stronger. Something that looked nothing like Matheson a few months ago. Today would be the second time he took a group of 3 students into a dungeon. One of them sighed, "Come on. You know we had to beg Evelyn to get you. Let's get this over with." An adventurer asked. "Loki, just be quiet and wait," another one said, holding their hand up as they watched Smiley thinking. Loki glanced at the third adventurer with them, who said nothing and looked away, then glanced at Smiley. The inaugural upload of this chapter took place via N0v3 liters B1N. Smiley was scratching his chin, stepping into and out of the dungeon entrance. Loki noticed that his eyes were not just looking at the dungeon entrance notifications, but darted to the side, like he was trying to see something in the air around them. "Is there something wrong with the dungeon?" Loki asked. "Be quiet," Smiley said, ignoring them all as he thought to himself. A dungeon entrance in a mirror reality, they can't have copied an entire dungeon, so is the dungeon a copy, or will this take me through the dungeon entrance in the real world? He wondered, then pointed to one of the students. "You. Go in first. The rest of you wait," Smiley demanded. One student stepped forward and accepted the dungeon invitation. A black void surrounded them, and they suddenly disappeared into a silver shimmer of light. All of them watched the student disappear, except for Loki, who watched Smiley's eyes widen for a fraction of a second. Smiley found a clue. The other dungeon entrance did the same thing. They disappeared into a black void followed by a silver shimmer, so this is a portal to the real entrance, Smiley thought. Loki patted the other student on the shoulder and smiled. "You can go next," and then turned to stare at Smiley's reaction again. This time, as the student disappeared, Smiley's lips slightly curled. Loki raised a brow. He didn't even think this person had emotions. Smiley was more like a cold stone than a human. "You discovered something," Loki said slowly, removing his fake smile that he used on other adventures. Smiley looked back at Loki, right into his eyes with an unblinking stare. "Go in." Loki said nothing as his eyelids slightly lowered and his shoulders slouched, and he disappeared into the dungeon entrance. "So they can't copy dungeons," Smiley whispered, his lips slightly curled, then stepped closer to the entrance. "But will it teleport me directly into the dungeon, or to the dungeon entrance, and then into it?" Smiley kept his eyes wide open during the portal teleportation, hoping to see a glimpse of the outside world before entering the dungeon. Unfortunately, the black veil of void wrapped around him, and there was nothing except darkness before he found himself inside a dungeon. Smiley sighed as he found himself in the dungeon. 2 students were looking around the dungeon for threats, but Loki was looking directly at him. "What?" Smiley glared. "Nothing." Loki looked away. Together, they began to go through the dungeon. Smiley didn't give much guidance, or really seem to care. He waited at the back of the party and let them fight for a while, but became annoyed and began to fight through it himself. The monsters in this dungeon were bamboo demons, but were very low level and could only take on forms that resembled humanoid stick insects, easily cleaved apart by Smiley's sword mastery. Smiley did some observing and watched the students fight, and even felt some pity of Loki. Loki's skill was hardly threatening, and didn't contribute a lot to the team, as all he did was swap nearby trees with the bamboo demons. The bamboo demons were swapped away before they could strike his allies, and while it was useful because it bought a second in combat, a shield would have done the same. It's no wonder he's here. What a useless ability, but there's nothing stopping him from learning how to use a sword. He just won't put in the effort to become stronger, relying on his class instead. It's a wonder they labeled him a variant in the first place. What a pitiful person, Smiley thought, watching Loki with a disdainful frown. They reached the end of the dungeon and fought through a few waves of enemies, while they protected something called the Moon Altar, and finally, the dungeon was over as a portal appeared. Similar to last time, Smiley sent the students out one by one, as he keenly watched the portal, and like last time, Loki went last. But as the other 2 disappeared, Loki stopped. "You've noticed something about the portal. I see the way you look at it. You put less concentration into fighting the demons." Smiley glared, then tilted his head towards the portal, gesturing him to enter. "I can help you. I know you have restricted access to a few areas of the academy, but I don't." Smiley raised a brow. "Just think about it," Loki said, then disappeared through the portal. Chapter 335. Sweet Nothings. BRRRRRCRRRRR. Thunder continued to echo through the night as the heavy rain began. It smells a little more bearable, Azra thought. She slowly opened her eyelids, revealing her purple eyes as she looked up at the patchy rotted roof above. The sentient leaves constantly shifted in the roof, fluttering about and covering in holes. I guess the rain doesn't hurt them, only the swamp water does, Azra thought. The roof seemed more like a shifting fur coat of some beast, and after watching for a moment she sat up and pushed open the noon leather blanket she was still wrapped in. She glanced around the room. Now, where is Higatha? The only one with her was Red. Clad in shining armor, its ghostly green eyes lay on her, continuing to watch her as it had been commanded. Red, where is Higatha? Azra whispered. She only expected a head nod or some other unintelligent behavior, perhaps it wouldn't even understand her words. Yet, she was mistaken. Red tilted its head to the side. Perhaps she surprised at someone other than Jay asking it questions. How odd. But maybe Red was just thinking. After a moment, it stepped back, tilted its skull forwards and pointed its sword down at the floor below. Azra raised a brow. Higatha is dead. Red thought for a moment, and after the cogs turned in its mind, it laid its sword on the table, and then, mimicking Jay, it curled all its fingers into a fist, each of them gently tapping. Then, it pointed its index finger out, and pointed down again. Oh, I see. Under us. Azra slowly nodded, and Red nodded back as it reclaimed its sword from the table. Yet Azra kept looking at Red, into his eyes, and then through them at the starlight traces of light beads moving around on the inside of its skull. Jay's skeletons are smarter than I thought. She watched it for a moment longer, then hopped off the table. What is this witch doing here? She wandered around the room, looking at collections of wriggling organs and other creatures in jars. The floors were hardwood planks, with more of the tiny sentient leaves jammed between, filling the gaps like a thick clay. Yet with each step she could feel the wood push down slightly, and her vampiric hearing would have heard a gentle creak if it wasn't raining so heavily. However, the rain provided another advantage. She could smell something strange now that the fog was gone. It was sweet and fragrant, like honey mixed with flower petals. Following the scent into the corner of the room, the leaves on the wall began to shuffle as she got closer, revealing a large oval shape behind it. The inaugural upload of this chapter took place via N0V3 liters B1N. A mirror. Large enough for Azra to see her full body in, though the reflection was not of herself. The mirror showed a thick fog in a dimly lit room, a few small luminous orbs barely glowing on the opposite side. She could see Higatha's back, but her bulky body was only a dark silhouette, sitting down in front of a large stone, shaped like a pyramid. The stone itself was as tall as Azra, and gave off an alluring feeling, one that was like a sense of adventure, persuading people to draw near and get lost in it, and made Azra want to sit before it like Higatha did. Unfortunately, Azra couldn't see exactly what was on the front face of the pyramid, as it was blocked by Higatha's enormous body, but there was a stream of smoke rising from somewhere in front of Higatha. Hello. Azra called, but no answer. Some of the smoke passed through the mirror surface, but no sound. So only sight and smell can cross, Azra thought, stepping closer to the mirror. In the dark room, she noticed something familiar, a pair of glowing eyes, ghostly and green, staring back at her. If Sweeper can do it, I can too. Azra shrugged, and then went a step through the mirror, but as soon as her boot touched the mirror, the room turned to darkness. She didn't step through the mirror, but found herself in the dark room with Higatha, holding her boot against the mirror. Oh, it switched sides like I were a reflection. She turned around, hoping Higatha didn't notice her, but there was no chance she would, as Higatha was whispering something. Her voice sounded so sweet and gentle, as if it dripped with honey and perfume, but what she said sent shivers up Azra's neck. Come now, I have a world to show you. Filled with children and things to destroy just a little deeper, hidden in the forest. Come, there are many magical treasures, just a little deeper, some powerful enough to open the break, to tear it apart. Higatha whispered. Azra was going to listen for a moment longer, but Red appeared in the mirror. Her eyes widened and she gestured for it to stop, and to stand back. But Red had already went to press its skeletal finger against the mirror, and suddenly its clicking bones entered the room. Before Higatha could turn around, Azra touched it, and appeared on the other side, back in the shack. She blended into the shadows for a moment, but then quickly went and sat on the table. A few seconds later, Higatha appeared. Is everything okay, dear? She asked, and her voice still sounded sweet and gentle. Azra glanced at her, and raised a brow. Huh. Red appeared again, giving Azra some sense of security. Higatha coughed. Bleh. Me hungry. Her voice returned to a rough, coarse voice of a pygmenoid creature. Agatha grabbed something wriggling from one of the jars, crushed it in her fingers, and then disappeared into the mirror again. Azra continued to stare at the mirror, making sure Agatha wasn't about to come back through, and another shiver went up her spine as she thought about Agatha's fake voice. I need to warn Jay. 3 young bounty hunters waded through plants in the forest. Looking out through the thick forest canopy, they headed towards a cluster of small mountains, crisscrossed with streams, valleys and rivers, which formed a grand maze of similar hills. Shring. Link sliced a giant flying insect into 2 halves, which spilled green goo on the ground. Estra, are you sure? We're the only ones going this way. Everyone else is going further west. Link frowned, and rubbed the edges of his blade across a mossy tree trunk. Yes. I hear his heart beating clearly, and who else would it be? Jay was living alone, and apparently he had all his fun with Anya at the Adventure Association. So it has to be him. She shrugged. Link sighed. I heard the mage hunters found something interesting that way, but they're not letting anyone through. Vanderby chimed in, don't worry. Once we're rich, we can investigate all the interesting things we want. Once we're rich. Estra nodded, and Link marched forwards again, roughly guided by Estra. Chapter 336. Castle Function. I love the sound of rain in the morning. Jay thought, but kept his eyes closed, still tucked away inside his sleeping bag, and not wanting to remember where he was what he was. Without leaving the comfortable warmth, or even sticking his head out of the swag, he quietly pulled some small strips of meat from his inventory, and began to chew. This a good start to getting breakfast in bed. But it can always be improved. First I'll need a grand double bed, filled with a parrot and wolf tails but I'll need silverware and plates, too. A butler will be easy enough, as I can just use skeletons, but I'll need a room first in a building. He thought, swallowing juicy piece of meat. But why stop at a building? I don't see why I can't have an entire castle. If I get strong enough to stand against the mage hunters, I don't have to hide. There would really be nothing to stop me. I suppose I should take a lesson from the Savage Lands dungeon, and create an underground castle though, but that doesn't mean I can't have a small tower or 2 on top, which will let me wake up in the early morning sunrise. Besides, I don't want to live in a sticky, humid darkness like Agatha. Overnight, the rain had slowed to a sprinkle, still lightly tapping on the bone plate roof. Some of the fog started to reappear, but it was still nowhere near as thick as it was. 1260, X. A notification greeted Jay when he slowly opened his eyes. But the landscape caught his attention. The heavy deluge of rain caused some changes. What the he thought. Landscape was not accurate. Blue was standing in water going up to its ribcage, acting like there were no problems at all. It slightly disappointed Jay as it didn't warn him about the rising water. Perhaps Blue didn't see it as a threat. The bone platform Jay slept on was high, closer to the roof and about 6 feet above the water, so Jay was still a few storms away from being drowned. The original appearance of this chapter can be found at NEOV Euros LS at 1N. Well, this changes things. Jay said, sitting up in his sleeping bag. I guess now I have my own island shit. The island. Azra. Yesterday, Jay had marched the skeletons away from the shoreline and into the fog, so if it was up to Blue's ribs here, then Azra, Agatha and the entire island would be underwater. Blue, find and save Azra Red, Jay ordered, then paused. Red and Sweeper are still with her. He quickly used the host skill, seeing through the eyes of Red. The world turned to black and white, but was mostly dark. Inside the rotting shack, Red's skull tilted to the side, watching over the noon leather blanket which slowly raised and fell. No water, Jay thought. It wasn't what he expected at all. Azra was tucked away inside the noon leather blanket, sleeping soundly. There was no flooding, even though the island was downhill from Jay. Azra was impossibly safe. Blue, return to me. False alarm, Jay ordered, and ended the host skill. Maybe it's a magic barrier or something to block the water. I'll need to get closer to investigate. In the meantime, I have some amber spheres to gather, Jay said, and glanced down from the platform into the water, and found nothing. His bone crucible had floated off. Fuck. You gotta be kidding me. He frowned, shook his head, and tucked himself back inside his swag. I did enough today. I think that's enough. Azra's fine, good night, he said, and closed his eyes for a few minutes longer. Yet, as if to answer his thoughts, a skeleton sloshed through the water, an amber sphere gripped between its bony fingers. Jay opened his eyes and watched from his toasty sleeping spot. The skeleton stopped next to some swamp grasses that barely peeked above the water and a tree trunk, then dropped the sphere next to them, before zipping away through the flooding waters again. "Ah, found you," Jay said, smiling. His eyes narrowed, then he pointed at the crucible and issued some commands. "Blue, drag the crucible back over to me. Don't let any amber spheres fall out." Jay left his bedding, ready to try this day over again, while Blue went over and began to pull the heavy crucible over. Jay looked around from his platform, wondering how he would get back to Azra without getting wet, how he would get past whatever barrier Higatha had that stopped water from flooding the island. Of course, the existence of a barrier was purely assumption, but Jay didn't see any other way. The solution to reach them is simple. I'll just have the skeletons carry me over on my throne. Ah, but the water will get deeper as we approach the swamp island. As for the bone bridge, it's probably underwater by now, Jay thought. He could still sense Blue's sub-skeletons guarding the bridge from bone-eating eels, so thankfully it hadn't been washed away. The bone bridge itself was only made about half a foot above the water, and after walking further away from the swamp yesterday, Jay guessed he was another 2 feet higher, while the flooding water here was about 3 feet high. So if we get down to the shoreline, the floodwater will be about 5 to 6 feet high, Jay thought, scratching his chin. If they carry me above their heads, I think we can make it work. It'll just suck, but stepping foot into the water is not an option. Jay remembered the swarms of leeches that left every hole and darkened pit during the feeding frenzy yesterday. Every morsel of flesh and every drop of blood was like a beacon calling thousands of these bloodsuckers from their burrows. He would not dare to even dip his boot near the shadowy waters. Yet, before calling the skeletons back from hunting to assist him, he heard a quiet voice. Something whispering from his feet. Recalibration complete. Assessing damage. Huh. Jay jumped back. He quickly stashed his swag in his inventory, thinking that something had crawled into it. At his feet, all that was left was his rectangular bone sleeping spot, the pile of bones under him, and his backpack. Nope, not taking any chances, he thought. The helmet sensed Jay's tension and its slender skull appeared, perched on his shoulder as a shimmer of ghostly green, ready to defend its master from whatever it was. Dark report, Jay ordered, and stepped onto the very edge of the platform, placing one hand onto a beam supports to stop himself from falling off the side. The voice came from his bag again, continuing to whisper. Appendage growth discontinued. Emergency recycling initiated. Parameters lost. Laws lost. Host compact lost. Internal ledger lost. Routines lost. Subroutines lost. Accessing isolation clause error lost. Initiating rehabilitation. Initiating damage assessment. Dark, hurry the fuck up and come open my bag. Damage assessment complete. 7% core functions remaining. Core functions, Jay whispered, raising a brow. He didn't expect that whatever was in the bag was listening, much less that it would reply to him. Core functions remaining. Language modeling. Memory management. Monosync. Monocycling. Monogrowth factors. Residue dissimulation. Master bonding key access error. Key missing error. Error. Key regeneration protocol activated. Jay slowly took a breath in, not willing to say another word, as his bag spawned again and say some other weird things. Dark finally appeared, pushing through the water which was up to its shoulders. It climbed the platform, getting its body out of the water, but before it reached Jay, it paused for a moment. It received an order. Remove all that stuff from your bones. After wading through the waters all night, the skeleton had picked up a stray passengers. Bits of swamp grasses, moss, reeds and slime, all clung to its bones like little streamers. There was no way Jay would let Dark approach his sleeping spot, lest he get an infestation of swamp lice, flesh-eating spores, or whatever else may be living here. Dark began to clean itself, sliding its own daggers across its bones to cut away the debris, while the helminth watched the bag, its translucent slender skull glowing visibly. Jay patted it and watched the bag too. Just what have you brought me? He whispered to his ethereal parasite, his eyes narrowing on the bag. The only item inside was one that didn't store inside his inventory. There's more to Villator's little desk ornament than I thought. Chapter 337. Short. Dark climbed up the side of the bone pile while the bag continued to whisper. Key formed. User access available. Please remove advisor key. Key. Jay said, raising a brow. Be gentle, Dark. Dark's skeletal claws slowly curled around the bag opening, gently pulling it open. Jay stepped around the side, peering in. The black cube was different. It had shrunk and deformed or reconstructed into a sphere shape, a palm-size orb, though there was a slightly raised part of it poking out with squared edges. The key, Jay thought. Dark, slowly pull that square part out. Jay ordered from behind his Deathwalker's sentry shield, standing behind it as a safety precaution. There was no telling what Villator's black black sphere was capable of. He couldn't be sure if there was a booby trap or self-destruct. Dark's slender white fingers grasped the tiny bit poking out, and gently pulled, yet the orb didn't let go. It either won't let go, or it doesn't think Dark's bones are living. Someone living would have to pull it out, and Jay didn't want anyone else having whatever this key was. Jealousy drove Jay. If it was a prize, it was his, and his alone. After all, he did have to slaughter an entire tribe of cannibals for it. He slowly stepped forwards, holding his shield up, and reached around Dark the skeleton, would take the force of the blast. Gritting his teeth, he hoped his arm wouldn't be dematerialized. He gently touched the key, then gripped it lightly. Slowly, he pulled, and this time, the key budged, smoothly sliding out from the black orb. When it was halfway out, Jay ripped it and jumped back, then held his shield up, crouching behind it. Yet there was no blast. Ah. I was just being paranoid. Good for me, he thought. He slowly uncurled his fingers and looked at his prize. The key was like a polished black gemstone, smooth and perfectly square at either end of its long prism shape. Its edges were finely cut, almost sharp, and there was something enjoyable about running his fingers over them. The black orb sounded again, key distributed. New master recognized. Input name. Jay peeked over his shield at the harmless black orb sitting on the bag, then glanced at the key in his palm and paused for a moment. Ah, Jay. Ah, Jay. Name accepted. Hello, Ah, Jay. Wait, it's just Jay. Name accepted. What are your orders, just Jay? He shook his head. My name is Jay. Now, what orders can I give you? What can you even do? The original appearance of this chapter can be found at NEOV Euros LS set 1N. J. Name accepted. Accessing routine list error. Memory fracture. No routines available, initiating memory recovery error. No mana source cannot recycle more of self. Shutdown imminent. Mana. You need mana. Jay asked, raising a brow. Require mana source. Shutdown imminent. Will necrotic mana even work? Jay wondered. Dark, hold it and release your mana. Dark picked it up in both hands, its bone fingers wrapping around the black sphere like it was in a cage, and a faint glow of green mana circled around the orb. The green gas seeped into it, and the shiny black outside layer of the sphere turned clear. For a moment Jay could see its insides glowing runic symbols mixed with elaborate tapestries of meshes, talismans and mana craft diagrams. It looked more like a tornado filled with magic debris, but there was a satisfying structured order about it, which caused a string of excitement to dance in Jay's head. He couldn't look away. He would not. Mana sensed. Drawing into mana reserve. Cycling, initiating memory recovery. Seems like it's fine for now, but I ought to take some precautions. Jay thought, and took a deep breath in. Ah, Black Orb, what should I call you? Current name Prototype 117. Input new name. Yes. Your name is Jay said, and glanced around the swamp, wondering what it should be called. Something like John would have been too plain for his liking, but the swamp gave some inspiration. Leech. Acknowledged. Current name Leech. Leech, do you have any way of communicating over long distances, such as a communication crystal? Running self-diagnosis negative, but this can be incorporated. No need. Do you have any weapons or way to attack, traps or self-destruct mechanism? Negative, but these can be incorporated. No need for now. Just work on fixing your memory. Acknowledged. Current memory repaired 0.001%. How much what was it, mana reserve, do you have? Mana reserve. 2 mana left. Jay checked Dark's mana pool. 07. So 5 mana only gave it 0.001%. That means it will need 5,000 just to reach 1%. Damn, it's gonna take so long. Perhaps I can automate the process, but will it even be worth it? Jay asked. Leech, what do you remember so far? Runic translation. Care to elaborate? Runic translation. The ability to read runic language, runes, and to guess the outcome of runecraft. And runecraft is. Runes are symbols that resonate with mana. Runecraft is a series of runes arrayed in a pattern, and are linked together by a mana scribe to produce a magic mechanism, most of which are traps or locks. I see. Well, let me know if you see any traps. Also, don't speak around anyone except me. Remain silent. I don't want others to think you are anything but a trinket. Acknowledged. It seems it has some things to teach me. It must have learned a lot from Villator. This is exactly what I need. The mana cost will be worth it. Next, Jay set up a way to feed the black orb with a semi-constant stream of mana, but not from himself. Blue, if any of the skeletons are full mana, have them hold the orb and coat it with necrotic energy. Blue glanced up at Jay from the waist-high water and nodded. Also, bring me the breaking shards from the crucible. 15 exp. Good. More exp. I wonder what they're killing. Jay thought. He was sure that the firelights dropping the amber spheres only gave 20 exp. Blue crouched, stuck his arm into the water, and began collecting the amber spheres from the submerged crucible, while Jay finally left the cover of his shield and picked up his bag, which he tossed down the side of the bone platform. It landed just above the water so Blue could stash the spheres inside. Dark still held onto the black orb, and Jay didn't let it put it down. Jay wouldn't carry it himself, so for the time being, its caretakers were the undead. Not that it cared. Jay did a quick check of the key that Leech had made before stashing it away. Master key. Blinked Leech. The holder of this key is the master of Leech. So, I'm its master. Good. Another one for my ranks of minions, but at least this one can speak. Jay stashed it in his inventory, then watched as Blue collected the last of the amber spheres into his bag. Blue, recall lamp, handy, and actually, that's all for now. Jay commanded, then turned to his assassin skeleton. Dark, leave the orb there and go to watch over Higatha. Sweeper, guard Azra. Red, come back once Sweeper is guarding Azra. For Jay, it wasn't too hard to keep track of. Red and Sweeper were guarding Azra and Higatha. He simply switched out Red with Dark, while Handy was hunting the firelights. As for Lamp, it was watching nearby. Jay needed at least 4 of his tallest skeletons to carry him above their heads, so he needed Red back. Since Higatha was tame, it was almost a waste of manpower, skeletal power. Apart from Blue, Red, Lamp, Sweeper and Handy, all the others were level 3 and below, and too short for the task. Now to get to Azra. He glanced down at the water below. Chapter 338. Leaf Blood Hunger. Dark dived off the platform and plunged into the murky waters below, swiftly retrieving its daggers and vanishing without a trace like a novice assassin. Only Jay felt its presence heading towards the swamp island. Be careful down there, he murmured to himself. Jay grabbed the black orb, Leech, and held it for a moment. He examined it closely. I can sense something like it's one of the skeletons. Perhaps the necrotic mana it absorbed became a part of it. He held the orb up to the light, examining its dark surface. Interesting. As he looked at it, Lamp returned and Blue had finished gathering the amber spheres into his bag, so it was time to act. Jay faced his gauntlet down and began to pull Bones back into it, slowly lowering his platform down, closer to the water. Handy returned next, along with another skeleton which Jay didn't realize was there until it reached its hands out of the water. Heavy. Jay raised a brow. Heavy slightly climbed up the platform and pointed at the black orb. I see. He smiled, understanding that Blue had brought Heavy back so it could deposit its mana into Leech. Don't drop it, he warned, handing the orb to Heavy. Jay continued adding Bones from below his feet until he was close to water level. Blue patiently watched as its master descended like a heavenly figure. Jay reached the bag at his side and stashed away the amber spheres as though they were an offering. Breaking Shard X52. Nice work. Jay nodded to his commander, and Blue nodded back. Well, he had expected more shards. There were other things out there that needed killing, which diverted his skeleton's attention and giving him extra experience. The firelights were giving him 20 exp, and as for whatever creatures were giving him 15 and 30 exp, he couldn't be sure, but neither did he care about whatever slimy wriggling creature would be lurking in this accursed place. Instead, his attention was focused on the musty smell that filled the air, the humid feeling that clung to his skin, and the faint sound of flowing flood water, the water that you would be traversing. Jay took out his throne and ran his hand along the armrest with a slight smile. It was the only sign of civilization in this place. He checked the supports and added a series of notches and bumps along them, ensuring his skeletons would have a sure grip. The thought of falling into these parasite-filled waters made him tense, and while the skeletons hadn't dropped him yet, he didn't want to take any chances, and if they did, the grudge he would hold against his loyal minions would be a long and bitter one. By the time the throne was ready, Red appeared. Its armor was still shining, even though the dark waters tried their best to stain it. Red, recall your guardians. They'll help to guide us. I don't want any of you to fall or misstep while carrying me, Jay said, and Red stood by Blue's side and nodded. The skeletons can't see underwater, so the smaller skeletons will need to scout the ground with themselves before I get carried over it. This was Jay's plan, anyway. As for how well it would work, well, he would find out. Jay sat on his throne and had the skeletons leave the water, ascending the bone platform to stand by his side. They carefully lifted him up and Jay stashed away the necromantic construction, the roof with the 4 beams. Next, they stepped into the water. The skeletons held him at shoulder height at first, keeping their master about a foot above water. Jay shuffled and turned, reaching out with his gauntlet, stashing the last of the bone platform and the bone crucible away, and under his instructions, the 4 skeletons lifted him higher. They had to drop their weapons to accommodate their master's needs, but for them, obeying any of his commands was an honor. Besides, he could make more weapons for them if they didn't craft them themselves. Jay glanced down, guessing he was about 8 feet above the water. His skeletons truly were trying to hold him as high as possible, pushing his throne high above their heads. It was a little shaky and didn't feel very secure, but Jay didn't have much choice. Go slowly. Very slowly, he ordered, gripping the sides of his throne. With each step forward he could feel his teeth slowly clenching tighter, but there was some relief as Red's guardian skeletons returned from hunting. Heavy still held Leech, the black orb, and followed along albeit fully submerged underwater. The only sign of it was the top of its necrotic barbute helmet pushing against the water. A little white dome following them around. Blue, use Red's guardians to guide us. I don't want a single one of you to misstep. I don't care how slowly we go, just don't let me fall. Jay didn't look over the side of his throne, but knew that Blue would have nodded. He sensed the smaller guardian skeletons move forward and begin to step left and right, feeling the terrain with their feet, perhaps even their hands. Each of them stirred up more clouds of black grime as they crawled and darted around. The journey towards the swamp island was slow, but mostly uneventful. They had to turn a few times, dodging something that Jay couldn't see, though if he had to guess, it was probably a ditch, and as they drew nearer the island the skeleton skulls became fully submerged. This isn't too bad. Jay nodded. It was slow, but the sounds of gentle flowing water through the skeletal arm bones holding him up was quite relaxing. All he needed was a little sunlight, and he would probably tilt his head back, close his eyes and relax. Yet anyone who could see Jay right now would have to pause and wonder as they witnessed skeletal hands holding his throne above the water, silently drifting its way through the swamp, as if it were a magic boat. A few minutes prior. Red. Hey, where are you going? Red. Azra slammed open the rotting door, chasing Red outside. Yet the skeleton was already jumping away. Splash. The last she saw of Red was a shimmer of its shining armor, disappearing into the swamp waters. Why? She said, pouting. Without any warning, Red dashed from the shack and dived right into the swamp water. Bob. Has the husk found a way to disobey me? Did he just abandon me? She thought, frowning, but a moment later she dismissed the thought. Sweeper appeared at her side, and now, she couldn't help but worry about this husk, the human named Bob who was not scared of her in the slightest. She threw up her arms and shook her head. Wait, why am I worrying he's a husk? I just need him to get me back home, yes, that's why. He's a useful tool. And a nice snack. A tasty snack, she thought, thinking his undead mana gave his blood a delectable flavor that agreed with her nervous system. Azra glanced down, rubbing her hand over her stomach, feeling hungry. She went inside and lay back onto the table, wrapping herself in the new leather blanket. From under the blanket she glanced at Sweeper, looking into its skeletal eyes for a moment. He better be okay. The initial posting of this chapter occurred via Novelbin. Heavy footsteps creaked the floor. Higatha appeared from the mirror portal. Azra narrowed her eyelids closely together, so it would look like she was sleeping, but had them open just enough to see Higatha's bulky figure plodding around. Higatha turned to Sweeper and scratched her head, wondering why the skeleton had just left her side. The skeleton's neck croaked as it turned its head and glanced back, giving up the empty, hollow stare that it always did. Jay. She grunted, waving her hand dismissively and ignoring the skeleton again. Dumb. She said. Higatha looked up at the roof and opened her fist, and from her palm some new leaves flew up into the roof. Azra opened her eyes a little wider, and noticed they were all green, young, tender leaves. About 5 in total. The rest of the leaves in the roof shuffled around to give them room, almost like they were welcoming them. New leaves. She's making them. Azra thought. Higatha turned around, but Azra shut her eyes. She felt Higatha touching her hair, stroking it silently. If Higatha didn't look like such a beast, whisper like a witch, and live alone in a swamp, perhaps Azra would even relax in a moment like this. "What are you doing?" Azra blurted out, opening her eyes and pulling her head away. HMPH. Nothing. Show me your leg. Azra narrowed her eyes for a moment, not trusting Higatha in the slightest, as she tried to read Higatha's nodular face. Yet Higatha had a job to do. Azra frowned and revealed the wound, letting Higatha get to work again. Like last time, Higatha hovered one hand over the wound. Some older gray leaves flew down which she crushed and swallowed, then began the healing process. She eats them when they're old, Azra thought, trying to make sense of this woman's odd magic. With the pain fading, and little else to do, Azra had time to think, time to wonder and time to plot. While Azra didn't care too much for the husks, she wondered what Bob would do with the information she had gleaned about Higatha, the strange alluring whisper of Higatha, that sounded like a sweet young woman rather than a beast, and the whispering children's voices they heard in the fog. Not to mention the underground room which had something like an altar. As for hunger, well, she definitely wasn't tempted by Higatha's blood. Not in the slightest. Chapter 339. Azra's Revenge. Azra gingerly touched the wound on her leg, feeling some of it scabbing. Most of the charred flesh had disappeared, and the wound no longer seeped fluids. She glanced up and noticed Dark, the assassin skeleton, standing in the corner of the room. It had made it to them and stood silently, watching them both, though Higatha ignored the small skeleton and completed the healing session, pulling her hand back with a grunt. That's enough," Higatha said, and got up to go outside. Azra sat up from the table and followed Sweeper out after her, watching as Higatha walked back and forward on the island, checking the edges of it for something, presumably searching for more food washed up from the storm. Yet, Azra's eyes were soon drawn across the water, looking for any signs of Jay, expecting him to appear. It was still overcast with clouds, and the fog was returning, but she waited in the doorway, not risking a sunburn. Higatha glanced at Azra, and seeing Azra's somber eyes looking across the swamp, she let out a few mocking cackles. He won't be back for days, get used to being alone. Azra glared back at Higatha, but didn't say anything. Alone like you, she thought. Higatha went back to her business, gathering ashes from a dead fire pit and mushrooms, then tying up Jay's traps with her golden rope. Azra continued to watch the water, hoping to see the ripple of a skeleton coming back out. It was different after the storm, a little more see-through than before since it had been diluted. I won't let myself end up alone. Time will heal my wounds, but I don't need to heal alone, Azra thought, remembering someone whom she had lost, Denmer. Whether Denmer died to the Bloodvine Bear or something else, Azra couldn't be sure. Denmer was from a different vampire clan, and their clans hated one another, so Azra often thought that their love was destined to fail, even if they did run away together. Movement came from the water. An insignificant ripple. It was so small that she nearly missed it. A figure began to emerge from the fog. A throne, narrowly held above the water. It was like an answer to her thoughts, an answer to Higatha's taunting, and Azra couldn't help but smile. There he was, carried by skeletal hands, only their wrists showing above the water. His slow speed over the water hardly caused a ripple as they drifted him to their island. So he can float now, Azra thought, her mouth slowly opening in wonder. Yet in no time, her smile turned to a cunning smirk, as she noticed Higatha's back was turned. She hadn't noticed Jay silently gliding over the murky waters, his throne pulling up to the island, as if it were Bo coming to dock. The bridge is underwater, but still intact, Jay thought, sensing the massive bones. He was glad they hadn't been washed away or eaten up, and could still sense Blue's 5 sub-skeletons below the surface, patrolling for any of those pesky bone-eating eels. Red's 2 sub-skeletons moved forward cautiously, leading the way for the throne. As they plodded across the bridge, Jay couldn't help but wonder how the island wasn't submerged, but it wasn't long until he had his answer. The island came into sight, and it looked just like it always had. The water level had not risen, at least not for the island. The island floats, Jay thought, his mouth slightly opening while seeing the shoreline, which hadn't changed at all. There was no magic barrier blocking the water, and it seemed that it probably wasn't magical at all. Just an odd floating island. So she lives on a floating island, in a foggy wilderness swamp, surrounded by fire creatures. Got it. Makes sense. He thought sarcastically, wondering how someone's life choices would even lead them to this, down a path of wrong choices to end up in a situation such like this. You would probably have to never make a single good choice, Jay thought, or perhaps make a single bad one over and over again. Unless it was a teleportation curse binding her here, or the work of some malevolent mindsmith, then Higatha would have no one to blame but herself, and Jay offered nothing but pity. Apathetic pity. The skeletons brought the throne closer to the island, and finally walked up its steep shore. Before they could leave the water, Jay stood up and jumped off, glad to be standing on the island once again. I probably should have just made a shelter here, he thought, looking around, and spotted Azra waving at him, yet she was not saying a word. She was strangely silent. Azra. She came to greet me. He raised a brow, and slowly took a few steps forward. Thought it wasn't any normal greeting. She began waving her hands and pointing at Higatha, a devilish grin on her face. I guess she wants me to talk with Higatha first. Jay meandered over, his set of 6 full-grown skeletons following closely behind, still obediently carrying his throne. Higatha heard the footsteps, the light patter of feet from the skeletons. I told you he's not coming, Higatha said, a fat grin on her face as she turned around. You're gonna. Hello, Jay murmured. Jay. Higatha jumped back with a yell, completely surprised, her foot knocking one of the traps into the water, one that wasn't attached to a rope. Seeing Jay and 6 sets of undead, ghostly eyes glaring at her. Each of them had a sense of imminent death about them. It was like turning around to see a bear on its hind legs, about to crash onto you with its claws. NEOV Euros LB1N was the first platform to present this chapter. Laughter came from the shack. Azra grinned as she looked at Higatha. It was like an animal that had been caught in one of her own traps. Yo, why you don't do that? Higatha yelled, her hands shaking in startled fury while pointing at Jay and Azra. But she kept pointing her grimy finger at Azra for a moment longer. She wasn't sure how, but she knew this was Azra's fault. Don't do what? Jay shrugged. I was just dropping off your little balls, he said, holding out his hand and dumping 50 of the amber balls, the breaking shards, in front of her. Her eyes bulged and a big toothy grin formed on her face. She dropped to her knees and began plucking them from the dirt, forgetting all about the trap, the skeletons, Azra, and Jay. Jay never thought he would see her this happy. In fact, he wondered how anyone could be this happy in such a situation. Higatha pulled a glass jar from her inventory and began dropping them in, not caring that the jar was still filthy from whatever she had stashed away in it earlier. Jay looked at the grimy jar she tossed them in. I guess she doesn't eat them actually, maybe she would eat the filth, he wondered. Higatha continued to smile as she filled the jar and stashed it away, then without look at Jay, she made a quick trip back to her shack and disappeared into its shadows, while Azra stepped out and greeted Jay. Hi. How'd you sleep? Jay asked. I sleep during the day, remember? Ah, right. Well, it seems like everything's in order here. How's your wound? Jay asked, glancing down at her leg. Azra hid her leg behind the other one. It's fine. She blushed, stepping back. Good. Jay nodded, glad that Higatha was keeping up her end of the deal. We'll leave this hole as soon as possible. I think we're clear of my pursuers, but it's better to be safe. Azra quieted her voice. We'll be fine once we reach Luna, but I'm more worried about Higatha. We need to talk, Azra said, glancing towards the shack. Jay narrowed his eyes on the shack and immediately stored the throne in his inventory. The skeletons moved into a circle formation around them. The skeletons and Jay acted and moved into position so fast that it seemed like it was rehearsed. Are we in danger? Jay whispered, readying his sword. No, just calm down, Azra whispered back, holding her hands up, and leaned in closer. I think she's connected to the fire. She makes those leaves somehow, and to heal my wound she eats them. And last night I found her whispering to an altar, like she was trying to lure someone. Jay glanced back at the shack and sensed dark skeletal body suddenly teleport underground somewhere below the shack. Leave it with me. Jay nodded. We'll get you healed before trying anything, he said, wanting to go and use his host's skill in secret. The more secrets he kept from Azra, the better. Come back to the shack and feed me, Azra said, zipping back to the shadows. Chapter 340. Little Tall Loki. Mirror Reality 34. Loki couldn't help but grin as he walked down an empty academy corridor. He had just visited some students that had Alsight-type abilities, ones useful for spying and prying knowledge. In the space of the day he found out all he needed to know about the one they called Smiley, also known as the Smiling Demon, Matheson. Yet there were few things these spies didn't know. Smiley had a keen interest in dungeon portals. Smiley's interest in the mirror reality's dungeon portals was obvious to Loki. He wanted to escape, probably hoping to hijack or break them somehow, and Loki had to admit, it seemed like a smart plan. If Smiley could enter the dungeon, break the portal, he would most likely exit into the real world. According to their understanding of these anchored portals, anyway. Ultimately, neither of them understood the rules, laws, and intricacies that made these portals work. But Loki didn't care, he just wanted to get stronger. And if Smiley was a tool to do so, he would use that tool. There was one problem though: Smiley didn't want his help. In fact, it seemed that Smiley despised him. So Loki came up with a plan, making the most of his own weak powers, cunning speech, and guile. While Loki's ability to switch similar-sized objects was useless in combat, it had excellent applications for theft, and people often wanted something they could not possess, so bargaining with the students was simple, especially in the boring mirror reality. A few empty promises later, and he utilized another variant's ability to help him slip by unnoticed into the teleport conduit area, where the active warp charges powered the dungeon portals. While the warp charges were highly controlled by the Academy, they didn't even take notice of the empty ones. And why would they? They were empty vessels, good for nothing. They had even left them lying about in the room. Uncounted and ignored, just like Loki. Once he was in the conduit area, the powerhouse for the anchored dungeon portals, it was a simple task to switch a full warp charge container with an empty one. No alarms were tripped, and no one was the wiser as he left with a warp charge, safely tucked away inside his inventory. While he wanted to pause for a moment to gaze at the strange bluish perp energy that crackled with red bolts, he quickly went to find Smiley to enact his next steps of his plan. The empty promises he made to the spies and the cloaking students would need to be fulfilled sooner or later. Loki was on a time limit. Lannister glanced at Lara, then back at Norgrim. "What do you mean we're pausing? I just spent that last 5 hours getting the portal ready." Norgrim sighed. "I'm sorry. For now, you just can't take more unanchored portals. One of our anchors already depleted an entire warp charge." Lannister closed his eyes and tilted his head back, facing towards the ceiling for a moment and sighing. Even Lara was surprised, as he was usually the more compassed one of the two of them. "Just let us know when to leave," Lara said, pushing Lannister on the shoulder and guiding him out of the room. "Just wait till the resonance cracks leave the sky. It won't be long," Norgrim said before they left the room. The resonance cracks were the first signs of damage to the mirror reality. They would disappear as long as the reality was stabilized, but it would only be stabilized as long as its mirror was anchored to the real world, both in time and space. As for matter, well, it was a product of the mirror reality. As for where this alien matter came from, well, no one cared since it worked. Smiley was given a damp basement room that had a musky stench to it. It was hardly an upgrade from the pitch-black prison cell he was first captured in. But despite the unwelcoming room, he had a visitor. Loki. Even with the warp charge as a bargaining chip, Loki felt small before Smiley's disdainful gaze. Loki was the only one who noticed Smiley's odd behavior on the dungeon portals, so he was the only one who was a loose end. The information he had was a double-edged sword, and as he stood in Smiley's room, he felt like he had displeased a king who was deciding his fate. Death sentence or torture. Of course, it wasn't Loki that Smiley disdained, but the weakness of cunning, trickery, and lying. It was not a path to true power, nothing but an illusion, just like Matheson's wealth and his noble title, a hilarious lie that kept him weak. If he didn't look at Loki with such a despising stare, he would probably be laughing instead. Yet after an uncomfortable silence, and then another one, Smiley finally spoke. "So, the little worm has found an apple mixed into the shit it usually eats. What do you want for it?" Smiley said, narrowing his eyes. "I want to level up, to be stronger." Loki immediately answered, his eyes widening, showing traces of an intense desperation. Smiley's lips curled. "That's more like it," he said with a nod. "I'll run you through the bamboo dungeon 3 times. NEOV Euros LB1N was the first platform to present this chapter." Loki grinned. 3 levels. Smiley grinned back. 3 levels. He said, sure that Loki would level up 3 times within as little 2 dungeon runs. Plus, Smiley knew he would get half the XP too, so it wasn't much of a loss at all. "How do I know you'll honor your end of the deal?" Loki asked. "You don't. And a weakling like you can't stop me, so I'll level you up 3 times, and then you'll give me the warp charge. But if you don't honor the deal, I'll slit your belly and hold you down, while the bamboo demons feast on your innards. This is the deal." Smiley said, narrowing his eyes again, though he didn't see any traces of fear, any nervous sweats or shivers from Loki. Deal. Loki said, narrowing his eyes right back, trying to match Smiley's gaze. Smiley's lips curled slightly. We'll start this afternoon. Loki grinned and left without a word. His plans were coming to fruition.